I mean, it was shocking when I got all their records,
Uh-huh.
and I was flabbergasted that they were in just about every meeting and they were recording or taking notes on it.
Really?
And they would try and stir up little issues like Melrod got into an argument with Gilbert Arroyo that Arroyo didn't fight for a better contract at Crucible Steel, which was sort of COINTELPRO stuff because there was no such argument. And it was listen to this. AMC, when we caused the first big work disruption, went to the FBI, not vice versa, and said, "What do we do about this guy?" And the FBI wrote back, "Get rid of him."
Welcome back to Cream City Social, everybody, and we have another fascinating episode for you today with an organizer named John Melrod, an organizer who organized here in Milwaukee in the 70s and 80s, and you are about to be painted a beautiful picture of what that looked like, and honestly, what different times it was. This is part one of part two, and I'll leave the introduction for the interview, but if you want to hear more about John's FBI stories, let me tell you, they're fascinating. He'll be here in person in Milwaukee on April 19th at Boswell Bookstore on the East Side, doing a reading of his new book that we'll talk about in a minute. A link to that event is in the description and totally free, so I hope to see each and every one of you there. We won't know each other by sight, but I think we'll know. Also, little note about the audio. Halfway through, there's a couple crackles. It won't take you out of your listening experience, but thought I'd be professional and give you a heads up. And with that, here is a very honest conversation with someone who's already made positive change in Milwaukee. Well, welcome, John.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here, Will.
Uh,
I feel like I'm at a homecoming,
I was gonna.
having been in Milwaukee for about 18 years, or in the Wisconsin for 18 years, rather.
Well, we're reuniting over Zoom, and then you're coming back here pretty soon, April.
Yeah, I'll be there April 19th, and I'm going to be speaking at Boswell's at 6:30, and we'll have books for sale there, and I'll be happy to sign them, and we'll take question and answers. So hopefully it'll be a live exchange with folks who are interested in the book, which I hope after today's podcast there'll be more of them interested in the book.
I hope so too. And a question and answer is just a podcast in real life, so that sounds perfect. And the book that you're going to be talking about at Boswell Books on April 19th is called The Fighting Times, Organizing on the Front Lines of Class War. And it's basically your personal journey of a labor organizer in the 70s and 80s in Wisconsin, Milwaukee specifically, and then in Kenosha at the American Motors plant. I'm going to read a little bit of the summary real fast just to get a gist of what we're talking about today. So John Melrod, who we're talking to, faces termination, dodges the FBI, outwits collaborators at the UAW, and becomes the central figure in a multi-year, surreptitiously funded and orchestrated defamation lawsuit by the American Motors Company against the rank-and-file shop newsletter, Fighting Times, which John was the editor of. And in your introduction, you frame pancreatic cancer, which you got diagnosed with a couple years ago, as initiating this reflection. And you give a couple questions that your two sons started asking you once this whole experience started. And I got to read a couple of them because they crack me up, and I'm sure if I heard little snippets of my dad's stories like this, I'd have the same questions. But a couple of their questions were, why did you pull a shotgun on the FBI? Were you really a Black Panther in college? Why did you go to work in the factories after college? Did you get cancer from working at the factories after college? And did you really get sued for $4 million? And so kind of like you said in the introduction, those questions were dancing around the bigger question: would you do it all over again? And so that's what you tried to answer in your book, and that's what we'll try to answer today in our conversation. So, John, that was a long-winded introduction, but take me back. Where did this all begin? You said you grew up in Washington, D.C.
I did. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm just going to interject one comment real quickly.
Please.
In your introduction, there were quite a few editors of Fighting Times. It was a collective project, as was the defamation trial. There were three of us defendants. So it's my memoir, but the story is inclusive of the many people over the years that played important roles.
Like
But
everything.
the question was, can you repeat it?
Where did this all begin? You
Oh, okay.
started as a
Yeah.
DC, and how did you make your way to Milwaukee in the first place?
Well, I did start in DC, and I'll briefly just discuss that because it sets the foundation for a lot of this. I grew up in the DC, Washington, DC in the 1950s, and it was very much an apartheid-like city in those days. The divisions between black and white were as if there was a wall that had been erected to protect the Northwest side where whites lived. That we had air-conditioned buses, blacks had the old raggedy buses in 100-degree Washington heat. We used to go out to the amusement park in Glen Echo, Maryland as kids. And when I was 10, some stewards from Howard University picketed demanding that the park be integrated. It was segregated. And white supremacists put up a violent reaction to the picketing and to the opening of the park to black people. And in fact, they ended up pouring bleach into the pool. And then the whole amusement park was shut down. But even as a kid, I knew that something was really wrong. I wouldn't know how to articulate it, but I'd see chain gangs of black workers on the sides of the road in Virginia, with stripes and chains. And you got this sense that black people weren't being treated the same as white people. And that kind of laid a foundation for me because my first actual political activity was with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement. There had been three civil rights organizers organizing blacks to register to vote down south, and they were picked up by the police and then released through the back door to the Klan, who then killed them and dumped their bodies in a bog. And if I'm correct, in a later trial, some old Klansmen, I mean, this is years and years later, admitted to the crime and still weren't convicted. So, but my experience was sending out thousands of these letters to inform people about the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodwin, and to raise funds for SNCC. So I became very involved at a young age in the civil rights movement and also the anti-Vietnam War movement because, I was coming on draft age or the age at which kids were being sent to Vietnam. And it was a very real experience. And in 67, all over the country, we tried to shut the induction centers. In Oakland, they actually did shut the induction center, and it led to a couple of days of rioting. We went to Manchester, New Hampshire, weren't able to shut the induction center, but created quite a bit of havoc and got the word to the inductees on the buses that there were people at home disagreeing with the war in Vietnam.
How old were you when you sent those letters for SNCC?
For SNCC, I would have been 15 years old.
15.
And when we went to shut the induction centers, I was 17 years old.
Do you remember? Okay, so I want to backtrack a little bit. And in this apartheid, DC segregated air-conditioned buses on the north side, do you remember asking questions to your parents about why this is the case?
I don't think I did. I've tried to remember that exact question.
Yeah.
Because one day, a kid's father invited my father and me and him and his kid to go see the Harlem Globetrotters. And on the way, as you went into the black section of town, where the Globetrotters were playing, this other kid's father kept using the word Schwarze, which is a very derogatory term, like the N word
Mm,
in Yiddish. And I kind of looked at my father to see what reaction he had, and he really didn't react. Um, so I didn't get much of my political leanings from my parents. I mean, they were good Democrats and liberals,
sure.
but it didn't go much past that. I think they began to change a bit. I can remember coming home in the summer of 1968, right when the riots were happening at the Democratic convention. And for the first time, cops were beating white kids with billy clubs, just wailing on them. And my parents were there crying, watching the TV. And I think that's when they got their first awakening that America isn't a gentle place for everyone.
Hmm. Kind of makes me think of the George Floyd protests. Again, a wake up call
Well,
for a lot of suburban families.
that's really true. I mean, you see Black Lives Matter signs in all over the suburbs, at least around
Hmm.
here in Sonoma, California, and it did wake people up. It was actually an issue that we fought in Milwaukee. A young guy named was I think it was Jerry Brookshire. It's in the book. Was beat to death by the police, and we had a movement at that time demanding justice. And it was a big issue when we had May Day marches.
Mm.
And it was also an issue in Local 72, which was in Kenosha, when we had the first Martin Luther King Day celebration, night celebration.
Oh, really?
There was a speaker on justice for this Black youth who had been killed by the police. So we took those issues. When I say we, it was myself and other activists took those issues right into the plant. And not everyone agreed with them, but we felt it was important that they be put in front of people. And we were the first local in the country to win a day off in commemoration of Dr. King. Before it became a national holiday, before the UAW International
Hmm.
won it in the UAW contracts, little Local 72 had won it in our contract that we would have a day off.
Was that hard to get people to come on board with that? That feels like a no brainer now, but something so new and so different, something nobody else had. I would imagine that'd be hard.
Well, there were quite a few Black workers in the plant,
Hmm.
and they constituted a really powerful force for the union. They had all been segregated in the 1950s into the foundry. Um, at that time, American Motors actually built the car from one end to the other. They actually had a foundry to build the engines
Yeah.
and to create parts. And the company came into the foundry and said that they were going to cut wages 10%. And the foundry workers voted to reject that concession. And they went through on it. They shut the foundry, and Black workers were then integrated into the workforce. But that's probably in the late 50s. But a lot of them became really great, inspirational union reps. In fact, one of them was a guy named Jim Robeson. And he, along with another Black guy whose name was Willie Foxy, and Rudy Kuzel, a very militant, very respected white member of the bargaining committee, they all wore berets into bargaining. I think it was in 69 or 70. I don't recall the exact year. And all of a sudden, things blew up and they started calling it, is this Crumb, the Kenosha Revolutionary Union movement? Because in Detroit at that time, Black workers had Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, from Ford Revolutionary Union movement. So there was always, this kind of thing going on in the plant. I mean, they set up a picket line. The Fair Employment Practices Committee set up a picket line in front of Woolworths when there was the struggle to get Woolworths to allow blacks to sit at the lunch counters.
Oh, wow.
So even though this Kenosha is as far north as you can get from the South, the black workers and progressive union members were active and, had imparted an understanding, at least to some of the more open-minded and progressive workers there.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're talking about this, I want to circle back to it. You talk in your book a lot about the Black liberation movement meeting this workers' movement, the Black veterans from Vietnam now being militant, and that intersecting with this workers' movement and unionization in the factories. But before we hop into that, I think we'll kind of get there as we run through your time in the factories in Milwaukee. So right after college, you moved back and you decided, and I think it was it a distinct decision to go work in the factories? Did you have other options,
No,
dreams, or ambitions?
that's a funny question because it wasn't a distinct decision. That decision we were in when SDS, Students for Democratic Society, broke up in 1969. One of the outgrowths of it was the Revolutionary Youth Movement too, which was distinguished from the Weathermen who were Revolutionary Youth Movement one, I guess you'd say.
Okay.
And in RIM two, which many of us in Madison were members of or adherents to the ideology of, there were two principal planks. One was support for the Black Panther Party, which meant that we were quite active, even in Madison, in going to Milwaukee. There had been 3 Panthers arrested on trumped up charge of murdering a cop. And we were very active with Milwaukee activists in demanding that the charges be dropped. And we took that struggle to the students in Madison. In fact, I was the person with the responsibility of organizing sales of the Black Panther Party newspaper on campus. And we used to sell about 350 papers every week, mostly to white students. And that's what landed me first on the FBI's radar. They traced a call from my apartment on Mifflin Street to the Panther office in Chicago and said to investigate whether I was associating with Black nationalists. And that's when I first show up on the radar, which is actually posted on my website, www.jonathanmelrod.com. I put up there quite a bit of the quite a few of the memorandums that the FBI over the years sent to employers and amongst themselves on tactics they were using, et cetera. So they were always in the background in those years.
Sure, because this
And
was
the other
not.
principle,
Huh?
I don't want to miss the question. The question was, why did we go into the working class?
You got a good
And
hook with the
the
FBI.
other prong,
Hmm.
yeah, right. The other prong of the of RIM two was belief that it was only the working class that had the power, the strength, the potential class consciousness to change society in a transformative way. And all of us in the founding document for the organization, it said we will leave the campus to go into the army, the factories to continue our organizing. So it was a very organic move. There were probably, I'd say, 25 or 30 of us from Madison over a couple of years who moved to Milwaukee and all took factory jobs at factories that are no longer there. But in those days, you could walk into any factory and get a job at a union scale, good paying job. So we were all employed and we were all organizing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That makes me think if you had to do it all over today in this political landscape, this power landscape, do you think that would be the same decision you'd make? Do you think that that's still, do workers have that power? Are they still the source of this change that could come about?
Well, I'll answer that 2 ways. I do believe they're still the source. And I believe that we're overlooking the fact that the Southeast is becoming very industrialized.
Mm.
There's an enormous auto network and heavy truck equipment. They're building electric cars, they're building EV battery plants, suppliers, etc. And that's got to be part of the strategy going forward, is how to organize those workers. The UAW has not, unfortunately, been very successful. A lot of the efforts have been from the outside, trying to organize the workers on the inside to support the union.
Hmm.
My belief is, and I think it may be the UAW's belief at this point, because there weren't that many successes, is you got to have people in there on the job, talking to fellow workers, and fellow workers seeing what were these union organizers about. Are they similar to us? Do they have the same concerns, etc.? So I think, remember, the United States is still one of the two largest industrial powers in the world, China and the US. So I believe we underestimate the numbers of industrial workers that are at work in the United States right now. Unfortunately, in too high numbers, they're not unionized. The other side of the question is, when I had my very first in-store book night, was here in Sebastopol, my little town, in a local bookstore. And it was exciting because it was filled up. Every seat was taken. And at the end, a young guy came up to the mic and he was kind of shy. And he said, "Well, I really so much liked what you said. I want to change the world. What would
Yeah.
you recommend that I do?" And I said, "Okay, I'll be honest with you. If I were you, and I'm not saying you should do this, but if I were you, I'd go down to the Tesla plant to get a job, because A, there's already been union activity organizing there. B, Black workers have organized and filed a number of discrimination suits. And C, what could be better in life than bargaining against Elon Musk in his auto plant? It's a dream of every organizer. So I hope, as time goes on and there's more young people that are looking toward the working class, that we'll see them not just taking jobs teaching and nursing, which is great. I think that whatever you do to contribute to the political
Hmm.
movement is a plus. And I think that's a great thing. But I hope people will be looking with a little more strategic idea of where they should work. Now, it's interesting that because of my book, I'm now collaborating with some young guys, one of whom was fired at a Amazon facility in North Carolina, fighting to get his job back through the labor board. And I helped him prepare his case. Another just got fired at the largest IUE, International Union of Electrical Workers plant, 7,000 people. He was a chief steward.
Hmm.
And before he got fired, he called me up and he said, "I've watched every video that you've put up on the website.
Yes.
I've wanted to learn how to be a better chief steward, and I'm reading your book." Then he called me last week and they had fired him. So now we're really working together on how to set up a claim in front of the labor board that really shows that they fired him illegally for engaging in hours, wages, and working conditions, which are all protected under the Labor Act. So I've been meeting more people in the South, who, through the book, which has been exciting.
Yeah, you're almost making me think of the podcast. That's connected us to so many people here in Milwaukee. Yeah, every little bit counts, even if you're not on the factory floor. It's all building
That's
towards
true.
something. Yeah.
It's really true.
One last question before we move on to into again what you're organizing in Milwaukee. Do you think that has the working class changed since the 70s? Does the knowledge workers, that white collar work, it feels like a lot of that industrial base has moved to some of that white collar work. Do they still have a source of power? Has the power dynamic changed since then?
Well, that's a great question, because I was asked to moderate a panel at the Labor Notes Convention last June. And the panel was join a traditional union or organize an independent union.
Okay.
And one of the speakers was the president of the Alphabet Union.
Hmm.
And she was great. Interestingly, they first started out over more moral and political issues. I think it was whether the software was being used by the Defense Department and then from the Defense Department into aggressive wars like in Yemen. And they had started a petition, if I'm right. I hope I'm not
I remember
close to
this
right, at least.
actually. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember this.
And so she was talking, and I asked her, well, that's great. And I think it's so great you're taking up those political issues. But as a union, it's my feeling that you also have to take up the day-to-day issues that are being faced by your fellow workers. And she says, yes, we're making that transition right now because we want to keep growing this union. So they are organizing. They should have been organized at Twitter because Elon Musk has wreaked havoc with firings and, you know, discharges, not paying his subcontractors. You know, he's really just come in and gone gangbuster on raping the workforce. And I wish they had been unionized.
Classic investment banking. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. So there's still a little bit of power in the knowledge workers. I always just wonder sometimes when people call them workers, I imagine all of us are workers. Anybody who's working for a wage, salary, and there's power within us all. But
Well, you know, take that, what you're saying, one step further. One of the things we were very proud of in Madison during the anti-war movement was, you know, the anti-war movement got fairly violent. After the war kept on, and we kept seeing napalm kids on TV at nightly news, we saw villages being burned with flamethrowers with old women and children. We became increasingly frustrated, and that led to a lot of violence. And when we had our big marches that would go up State Street, we would have monitors that would stop students from breaking windows of little shop stores, mom and pops. And we would explain that the owners of those stores are in what we called the Broad United Front against the war. They're not the Bank of Americas. They're not the banks. They're not obviously the recruiting offices. And so students became very, very politically astute to leaving those buildings and those little bookstores alone. So, as you say, workers doesn't just mean if you're an Amazon worker busting your butt on those lines at Amazon, but it includes teachers and it includes nurses. And in fact, you know, when the issue's broad enough, it includes people like small shop owners.
computer coders, exactly.
Exactly.
So from the very beginning, out of college, you very much wanted to organize, and you found your first factory in Milwaukee, and it was a plastics injection molding plant. Can you tell us a little bit about your time there?
Yeah, that was called Easy Painter. Um, I doubt it's still there. It was in South Milwaukee, and it was mostly a factory of women, low paid,
Hmm.
which was a good place to start out because the pressure wasn't as great and the work pace wasn't as tough.
Hmm.
But I became somewhat unlucky because one of my jobs was to go down in this big concrete pit. We used to make the paint trays for Sears and Roebuck. And when a sheet of metal goes under the punch press, there has to be oil spread across it so it doesn't stick to the die when the part is pressed out.
Sure.
Then that paint tray has to be hooked onto a line that ran through this pit, and trichloroethylene burned off the grease. So one day my straw boss says to me, hey, Melrod, go down in there and clean up all the particles on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I look over at the barrel, 100-gallon barrel, and it's got a skull and crossbones on it. And it's trichloroethylene. And I said, well, all right, where's some protective equipment? I mean, a respirator, some, protective clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, that's for sissies, you know? Okay, you're on your first job. You don't want to be, it's not college. You can't take a pass
Mm-mm.
and walk out. And, I, on a number of occasions, had to clean it out. And I would go in, hold my breath for 30 seconds and jump out. But I started becoming dizzy, nauseous. And since then, I've researched it. And you can die from trichloroethylene poisoning, similar to alcohol poisoning. So it makes sense that that was one of the origins of my cancer. I mean, it was also when I got to American Motors many years later. I was a chief steward, and near the end of the line, the repairmen were using trichloroethylene to clean the grease off of the car bodies. And there had been complaints from the union that trichloroethylene be replaced by a safer chemical, which the company didn't do. And, we were all instructed to clean our hands in it because it got off all the grease.
Oh,
So that's part of why I call the book in the title Class War, because, those chemicals almost killed me. I was only given 6 months to a year to live. And the employer doesn't really care. The employer just wants to save pennies, nickels, dimes, whatever, to make the profit margin greater. So, that they send you in without protective gear.
I was going to say that's a through line of your book. Each of these factories you worked at, you were a little bit more exposed to the hazards of that life, of these cancer-causing chemicals. That's very similar.
That's very true.
Yeah, it's very similar to the plants I worked in. I actually can picture exactly the painting tub, booth, concrete pit that you're talking about. I had to clean those out. I was in charge of a paint line for a while. Yeah, we had respirators and we had aprons. So 2010s have been a little bit better for the safety wise.
Although, I mean, if you look at the railroad workers right now, they've cut crews, they've cut their employment by 50% over the last number of years. And it's 7 monopolies that own the railroad companies. And they're raking in, I think it was $55 billion in profits.
Oh, wow.
And then they spent millions and millions on stock buybacks. But they wouldn't give the railroad workers 5 days paid sick time. And as an example, one of the railroad workers, June of last year before the contract, he wanted to take a sick day off. I have his name in my notes to see the doctor, but he was afraid to because he would be disciplined.
Yeah.
And you don't have any time off with permission. And a couple of weeks later, he died of a heart attack, which was exactly what he had been complaining about. So that was like a year ago. So, in your case, you did have the respirators. In his case, he didn't have the 5 paid days off, which Bernie has been demanding in Congress, talking about hearings on the railroad companies. With those profits, why can't you pay the measly 5 days off for each of your workers?
Give them a little bit of dignity, a little bit of time. Yeah. I'm sure we'll get to the story a little bit later, but the paint line that you worked on, they sped it up to get more production out. And I remember them doing that exact same thing in the paint line. We were behind a little bit, end of the month, move it up to 1.25 speed, run through it just a little bit faster.
That's how they do it.
Same tricks of the trade. So after the injection molding plant, did you get let go of? Did you get chased out by the FBI in this first one, or did you move your way up into a different position?
I did. I wanted to be in a more strategic location. And everybody in the paint factory, we had a union, but a very weak one. But everybody knew about the guys from American Motors. They used to call them those radical union guys from American Motors. And the truth was, in 1969, there were some 13 or 14, I forget the exact number, of wildcat strikes in 1 week at the 2 AMC plants, the one in Kenosha and Milwaukee. So I said, well, that's the kind of place I'd like to be at. So, they were hiring hundreds of us. It was like going to Woodstock when you went into the employment office. Everybody was young. You know, the young white workers were sort of part of the generational Woodstock rebellion. And, there was a lot of workers of color. And the day that we started, the superintendent took about 35 of us in a group to show us where we'd be working. And we got to the press room, which is the first floor, with the pounding presses 2 stories high. You could feel the floor shake and the hot air whoosh by you. And interestingly enough, everybody they picked out of the group to work on the press line were people of color.
Mm.
So immediately I said to myself, well, that's an issue because they're not assigning people jobs based on any sort of fair system. So I got the job at American Motors, and I was putting in at that point taillights and 2 taillights per car. It's not easy work. I mean, you've been on an assembly line. It's mundane, it's drudgery, it's boring, it's physically difficult,
Surprisingly fast paced. Yeah.
surprisingly fast paced. Those cars come at you one after the other. And I had just made it into the union. It was a couple days after my 60th day, and I didn't get a morning break. And I kept yelling for the supervisor that I needed my break. He kept yelling, I don't have anybody. So all the other workers started yelling, walk off, Melrod. Don't you got the balls? Are you a company man of some sort? And,
Money where
I'm
your
going
mouth
through this
is. Yeah.
dilemma in my mind. Damn, I don't want to be looked at like I'm, passive acceptance of no break, but I don't want to get fired my second day into the union. But the decision came down on the side of walk off. I threw the taillights into the car. I went to the lunchroom, sat down. At that time, smoked a cigarette.
There you go.
And the foreman comes running up the line, red faced, and says, you're fired, Melrod. Get out of here. And right behind him is my steward, blue button shop steward, which is what they used to be in the old days in other plants like Chrysler as well. They'd have a little blue button. And he told the foreman, here, look at the contract, the working agreement, the black book. He's got a right to his break. He's within his rights. Melrod, go back on your job. And at that moment, I decided that's what I want to be, a blue button steward.
How long before you became one?
Well, it was a while because a couple of big struggles came up in the first couple of months. One was they tried to get us to work a Saturday overtime. And I went and looked at the contract, and it said all overtime is voluntary and up to the individual. So I went to the Xerox copy machine store and copied that paragraph in the working agreement. And the young guys, we all passed it around. I don't know if it was because we didn't want to work overtime, because we were partying on Friday night, or we just felt like 5 days was enough. But in any event, when they came around to notify people on a Friday to work the Saturday overtime, you could just hear people yelling, hell no, I'm not coming in. Overtime's voluntary. And they couldn't assemble a workforce. Yeah. So they had to hire some people because they were selling a lot of cars. A couple of months after that, they did exactly what you said, in a sense. They had a speed up. The way they did it was they were increased the line speed by 3 cars an hour. And for somebody who's worked on an assembly line, 3 cars an hour adds a lot of work to your job. And this time we got together a group of us, a couple of Vietnam vets, a couple of black guys, one Puerto Rican guy, a couple of young black church women who kind of had this sense of organization and community, and a couple of other people, and said, what are we going to do about this speed up? And we said, let's put out a flyer saying, no speed up, work at a normal pace. So we kind of crudely put together this leaflet and handed out at the gates. And all of a sudden, the seniority workers came alive. and they started teaching the younger workers how to ride the line. Riding the line meant that you did your job as long as it took you. So by the time you'd
Mm.
finish your job after the speed up, you'd be knocking the next person down the line, and they'd be knocking the next person further down the line. So it was all repairs. The aisles were full of repair cars. The
Yeah.
roof was full of repair cars, and they were sending workforce home in Kenosha because they didn't have enough bodies. They used to truck bodies down to the Kenosha plant. So then we decided, hey, let's up the game. Let's make up some T-shirts that say "Stop Speed Up" with a big red stop sign on them. So we went over to my house and we did it the old-fashioned way: a silk screen and a
Yeah.
squeegee. And we made the first 25, and they sold out right away. We went back to my house that night and we made up a lot more, and they sold out right away. Then the company came around and notified people, it's you be subject to discharge tomorrow for wearing one of those T-shirts.
I was gonna wonder.
And that was, I mean, I didn't want to get people fired, you know, for something that I was instigating essentially. And sort of suddenly, my steward came up and bought a shirt. My chief steward came up and bought a T-shirt. And the vice president of the union came up and bought a T-shirt. And they all announced they'd be wearing them in the next day. So
Yeah.
everybody who had a short wore one in the next day. And of course, then everybody was riding the line, working at a normal pace. The company backed off, took work off our jobs, had to hire in more people, which is a solid union principle. If there's unemployed brothers and sisters, let's bring them back to the work rather than work building more cars
Overtime. Yeah.
overtime, etc. So that was a very successful struggle, except that American Motors went to the FBI as if it was their own private Pinkertons and said, what do we do about Melrod? And there's a memo that's up on my website where they said, well, Melrod's in this organization, the Revolutionary Union, and they're all putting out the same kind of flyers that look alike. And Melrod's causing work stoppages and building caucuses, and you need to get rid of them.
Mm.
Well, a couple days later, some security guards came up, picked me up off my feet with me trying to like hold my ground, and dragged me out down the aisle with other workers yelling to sit down, and dragged me down 4 flights of stairs, and put me out on the sidewalk, and I was fired.
Wow. Did you feel like the ringleader at the time? Did you feel like you were the guy that they should have gotten?
Well, I guess if they were going to get anybody, I would be the one to get, because I had been the instigator, honestly, because I had been an activist all my life. So I was just doing what I had always done. But they did fire another worker named Al Guzman. And at first I thought they fired him to make my firing look less like it was just directed at me.
Mm.
As it turned out, in an irony, the FBI had sent a memo to American Motors talking about another worker who had been fired from Briggs and Stratton, which was a huge company at that time in Milwaukee. And they said, oh, that must be the same guy. So he got fired by association,
Because he had the same name?
He was just,
or
because he had the same name or a similar name, and he had passed out a couple leaflets. No. So there were both of us fired, and people started wearing big orange buttons, "Rehire John and Al." Oh. And there was a black caucus called Black and White Getting It Together. They put out a flyer calling for a union meeting to vote for strike. Older workers put out their own flyer calling for a strike vote. And a lot of the militant union people did. Now, I have to step back 1 minute. When those first 3 union representatives bought T-shirts, I learned my first lesson, which was I kind of came from the generation, if you're over 30, you're a sellout. And I don't think it was particularly ideological or political that I looked at them as, hey, union bureaucrats, they're no good.
Yeah.
But they opened my eyes that you've got to always be looking where you can make tactical alliances. If you can join with reform leaders that are high up in the union over certain issues, like is going on right now with the UPS and the Teamster reform leadership, that you got to make those alliances. So I think that's really an important political point for people who are struggling with the issue of, do we join a union? Do we form an independent union, et cetera? So they did. They were forced to call a meeting that we packed, and I got up and spoke, and there had been a lot of red baiting because of the FBI, and I got up and spoke, and I said, what's at stake here is basic fundamental union principles. We fought against speed up. We fought for voluntary overtime. That's the issue. If you let me get fired, it can happen to anybody. Now, if you want to talk to me about politics, I'm an open book. Come talk to me anytime you want to. That's great. But that's not the issue. Although the International had sent in a rep, he didn't make that the issue. He just said, the International feels like we've done as much as we can for Melrod, and don't put your families out on strike, losing money because of him. So the vote count came. The president of the union had a hand clicker. He counted the vote. He got angry. He threw the clicker down, and he said, that damn thing's broken. Let's do a voice vote. Of course, that vote we lost, even though we should have won it. And when we look back, the back of the room was filled with police, and they had expected there to be trouble and he had alerted the police to be there at the end of the meeting. So I was fired, and I'll quickly just go. I went to the labor board in Milwaukee that was pretty progressive in those days. And the regional director wrote the brief, blasted American Motors for McCarthyism, for red baiting, for obfuscating the real issue, which was my union activity. And they ordered me to be rehired, which I was 2005 days later by order of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals.
How many years is that?
2.5 years. And then I was basically went to the Kenosha plant.
What were you doing for those 2 years?
Well, I decided it was a good opportunity to learn about other sectors of the working class in Milwaukee. So I knew that I wasn't going to get a job easily, because if you get fired from American Motors, nobody's going to want to hire you. So I went to work at Pfister and Vogel Tannery, which along the river, there were 5 tanneries, because Milwaukee used to be a tannery center. Of course, they were all dumping their waste directly into the Milwaukee River.
Yeah.
And I think they're now townhouses along the river there. But in those days, it was a tannery. And, that was a hell of an experience out of something like, some book from the days of the robber barons. I mean, there were no rights, there were no union. The foreman had complete control over you. I saw a woman who we always were working 10 hours, and she was told we had to work 12 hours. She broke down in tears and said, I have 2 kids. And the foreman said, don't make your problem my problem. So I began to talk union a bit there, and I could see that it would take many years. You can't just convince people when you've been in a place for 6 months or so. So eventually I made my way. Well, I went to Crucible Steel, which was a foundry. And it was a 90-day probationary period. And on about the 88th day, the superintendent called me into his office on 3rd shift. And I had been a welder, breathing all of that welding smoke and also silica dust, because when you pour molten metal into a sand mold, you get silica in the air. And he said, I don't know, you're a good worker, but some federal people told me we got to get rid of you, so you're fired.
Really?
The FBI had visited him. So there went that job. So then I decided I had to be a lot more tricky. And I used payphones to call companies to get a job. And I landed a job at Oh yeah. I mean, I took different routes when I was driving. I mean, at one point, the Milwaukee Red Squad, which was a division of the Milwaukee Police, pulled me over, told me to get out of the car, and it was about 0 degrees. Put my hands on the back trunk, take your gloves off, they said, and then they just left me there for an hour to just show who was boss. But anyway,
What was
I,
it
I
like to be
got
thinking
into work.
or sorry to cut you off, but what was it like to feel like the FBI was following you? And this just seems like such a different time to me, organizing wise. I mean, FBI tapping your phones. I feel like we still hear about that today, but we don't have police officers lining up in the back of staff meetings. It feels different. Do you feel like it's different today?
Well, yeah, I think the FBI has been rolled back from taking that kind of active role
Hmm.
among union organizers right now. I mean, that's not to say that it may not come back again, but they seem to have their hands full with, they say, Muslim terrorists, but certainly with white supremacists. Um, but we just took it as that was part of life then. I mean, they
Yeah.
had just killed Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and assassinated him in his bed, and that was orchestrated by the FBI. So it just seemed to be part of life that you had to live with and do your best to circumvent the FBI or the police red squad the best you could.
Yeah. Did you think that that could happen to you? Be assassinated at a certain point?
Well, you know, being a white student,
Hmm.
I didn't really have that fear. I mean, they had killed another couple of students at a black college down south in an anti-war protest. But they did, for the students they killed in Kent State in 1972 when Nixon invaded Cambodia, were white. But by and large, they didn't do that kind of thing. I mean, we were in pitched battles with the National Guard and the police, but they never pulled out weapons and used them.
Yeah.
Now, years later, I did think my life was in danger when I was up on the Menominee Reservation during a very militant takeover by Vietnam veterans of the Abbey, demanding that it be made into a hospital. And I was up there with another political activist, Doug, and we were organizing up there. And the white supremacists were driving around on ski mobiles with long long rifles, shooting into the Abbey. And we
Wow.
marched on a lot of the Milwaukee people came up from other factories, from the Revolutionary Student Brigade, the Unemployed Workers Organizing Committee, all came up on a march on the weekend. And we marched to the police lines where they had surrounded these Menominee warriors who were all Vietnam vets, Native Americans. And we were able to bring enough press to put the pressure on Governor Lucy to pull the state cops out, bring the National Guard in, and they went into negotiations and won the Abbey as a concession for a medical center.
Oh, wow. So, yeah,
That was in
activism does work.
73.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was in 73. I mean, activism does work. I mean, you're not always fear free. I mean, I was pretty nervous walking up to these police lines because they had me leading the march because they had said, well, how do we know you're not an FBI agent? And I said, well, I'm not. And they said, well, to make sure, we're going to have you in the very front row of the march. So if they do open fire, you're the guy that gets it. So there's a picture from an old copy, 1973, from the Milwaukee Journal with a picture of Native Americans march on Abbey. And then there's a picture of me
You're-
on the bullhorn leading the march. So at that point, I was a little intimidated, I will admit, but everything turned out okay.
Do you remember a moment of courage, of realizing the gravity of the situation and moving ahead anyway?
Well, I kind of recognized the gravity of the situation when, after they killed Fred Hampton in Chicago, the Panthers had asked us if they could send Bobby Rush, who's now a congressman, up to speak in Madison. And at the last minute, Bobby Rush couldn't come. but the deputy defense minister, Calvin, I forget his last name, came. And somehow I drew the straw that made me the bodyguard for
Oh,
the
wow.
three Panthers that were coming to speak at the student union in Madison. And in those days, Panthers were fair game, and I was with the Panthers. So I had a shotgun in the trunk of the car, and when I got to the airport, three Panthers got off and they took handguns out of their briefcase and bullets out of their other luggage, because in those days you could carry each if they weren't in the same luggage, and they loaded up their weapons. And that time I said to myself, wow, you know, this is really a potentially dangerous situation. And let's just say I drove right at 35 miles an hour, not looking right or left, and then led them into the student union from a side door and stood on stage next to Calvin, the speaker from the Black Panther Party, with a shotgun on my hip. And I said to myself, this is, somebody had to do it. And, you know, why am I any different than anybody else?
Yeah.
I've taken on this responsibility, and I'm probably going to get kicked out of school tomorrow anyway. But I never was. So those days, students were so out of control and powerful that the administration never did anything about it.
Do you feel like, yeah, that's so interesting. I'm thinking about, yeah, what that would look like on a school campus today. And definitely still not the same power in the students. No.
I dare picture that, yes, exactly. I'm not sure I would do it again, because as I thought about it years later.
Come back next week to find out what else John wouldn't do again, what organizing with the Black Panthers was like, and ultimately what landed John in a $4 million lawsuit. As always, thanks for listening. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you next time.